Okay, so welcome to this roundtable on the uprising in Iran that has been happening since mid-September after the death of Mahsa Jina Amini. My name is Dominique Bourg. Can you hear me? I'm a professor at the Institute of Feminist and Gender Studies and at the Department of French Literature here at the University of Ottawa. Thank you very much for being with us tonight. There is little information available right now about the situation in Iran. Among the things that we know is that at least 4 men between the age of 22 and 39 have been executed. We also know that the police are targeting women in the face, breast, and the genital area, and that some of those that are in prison are at risk of being raped. In December, the United Nations ousted Iran from its Commission on the Status of Women. Because of the lack of information regarding what is happening in Iran, since its government decided to limit the access to the internet, the team that organized this event thought it was very important to invite specialists from various disciplines, as well as a young activist from the Iranian diaspora. On behalf of this team, I would like to express our gratitude to the sponsor of this event, namely the Research Chair on Urban Anthropocene and Research Center on the Future of Cities, de la chaire de recherche sur l'immigration et les communautés franco-ontariennes du Collège des chaires de recherche sur le monde francophone de l'Université d'Ottawa, the Department of History, the Alex Trebek Forum for Dialogue, and finally, the Institute of Feminist and Gender Studies. All these sponsors are from the University of Ottawa. The team that worked on organizing this event is composed of 2 Iranian doctoral students from the Faculty of Social Science, namely Farinaz Basmeki and Roudabe Dehani. Of 1 university alumni, Dr. Radamis Zaki, and of 2 professors, myself and Professor Rim Seferjeli from the Department of History, to whom I will now hand over the floor.
Thank you, Professor Bourg, and welcome everybody to the roundtable, the Iranian uprising from town to town and beyond. First, I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I am grateful and honored for the privilege to be on this beautiful territory, and I acknowledge that participants across Canada are located on traditional territories of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. So we're joined today. I'm not going to go again on the on what happened on 13 September 2022. We all know that a young student, Mahsa Amini, was arrested and tragically died a few days later while in custody. But it's important to remember that her arrest and death sparked a wave of nationwide unrest in Iran in what has been described as the biggest challenge to Iran's regimes in years. This movement, the protest movement, have reunited various segments of the Iranian society and have gathered support in Iran and outside of Iran. In Iran, the regime has responded to the wave of protests with harsh repression, which has included the execution of at least 4 people. Now, we're joined today by 4 experts on Iran to address the situation and to hear their perspectives and analysis on the current situation in Iran. Our 4 participants are Professor Homa Hodfar, Professor Shahrzad Mojab, Professor Thomas Junot, and Mina Favar. And I'm going to introduce each of them before giving you the floor. So Professor Homa Hodfar is a professor of anthropology emerita at Concordia University. She's a prolific writer and is the author of numerous books and many articles. Her research is in political economy and legal anthropology, focusing on reproductive rights, Afghan women and youth refugees in Iran and Pakistan. Women in formal and informal politics, hijab and dress codes as political institutions, gender and citizenship, Muslim women's sports as politics and gender and the public sphere in Muslim context. Professor Hodfar is also active in the Women Living Under Muslim Law Feminist Network, whose mission is to promote gender equality and plural democracy. Next, we have Professor Shahrzad Mojab, who is internationally known for her work on the impact of war, displacement, and violence on women's work, learning, and education. She's a professor at the Women and Gender Institute and at the Department of Leadership, Higher and Adult Education at the University of Toronto. She's also a prolific writer, and a unique feature of Shahrzad's work, Professor Mojab's work, is making knowledge accessible to public using arts such as storytelling, dance, drama, painting, and film. She has archived and curated the experience of women in prison in the Middle East on the website The Art of Resistance in the Middle East, and she collaborates with artists to aesthetically enliven the results of her research. She also works with a collective on the revolutionary pedagogy. Next is Professor Thomas Junot, who is an associate professor at the University of Ottawa's Graduate School and Public and International Affairs. Professor Junot research focuses on the Middle East, on the role of intelligence in national security and foreign policy making, and on Canadian foreign and defense policy. He's a non-resident fellow with the Sanam Center for Strategic Studies. And from 2003 to 2014, he worked with Canada's Department of National Defense, mostly as a policy analyst covering the Middle East. Last but not least, Mina Favar studied intercultural relationships and international cooperation in the Middle East at Université Lille 3 and obtained a master's in sociology on international conflicts from the Catholic Institute of Paris. She also detains certificates in sociology on violence and social entrepreneurship. She is the co-founder of Feminists for Jina in Montreal and an active member of the Iranian Women Association. And she started a PhD on the modalities of resistance of Iranian civil society against the misogyny of the Islamic Republic at the Institute of Feminist and Gender Studies at the University of Ottawa. So each speaker will present their own perspective on the situation in Iran for approximately 10 minutes. The first questions for our experts will be asked by our doctoral students, Farinas Basmeshi and Rudabe Derani, two Iranian doctoral students from the Faculty of Social Sciences. We will then open the floor to the public for questions. Our first speaker will be Professor Homa Hodfar, followed by Professor Junot, then Mrs. Favar, and finally Professor Mojab. Thank you for having accepted our invitation. And Professor Hodfar, the floor is yours.
Thank you for your invitation and introduction. Well, I was asked to give a general view of the Uprising Women Life Freedom that most people were surprised by it, but most Iranian and those who follow the politics in Iran do not find it surprising. In fact, if anything, some of us expected this a bit earlier, at least after 2020. But the burning question for many is this a revolution? Is it a social movement? Or is it just a revolt? So this discussion has taken quite a lot of debates amongst the scholar. And the other thing with it, the other question that generally people ask, would this uprising bring the regime down? And those of us who maybe have been a little bit worried about, at least those who have experienced the previous revolution, they wonder if even this time, even if the revolution is a revolution and is successful, would women be better off? So I want to just very briefly say why we don't find it, it wasn't a surprise for us. In some way, because we don't actually follow the day-to-day politics, certainly not the feminist resistance in Iran in a large way. Media isn't interested in to follow those things. they are surprised because they are not aware that, in fact, Iranian women have been very politicized from early on. At least since from the 1990s, they participated in tobacco movement and then in the constitutional revolution from 1905 to 1911. But women, after they came to the street in 1890s for the constitutional revolution, they never went back home. With the Constitutional Revolution in 1905, which was then revamped in 1911, women were very disappointed because they had assumed they would be given citizenry rights just the way men would, which they didn't. But of course, at that time, no other country, maybe except New Zealand, women didn't have the right to vote at the turn of 20th century. But so women at that stage decided they're going to focus on three major demands. Mass education for women, because there were very few women who were educated, and religious group were opposing modern education, especially for women, and the right to vote and reform of family law. So with those in mind, in fact, for 6-7 decades of struggle, they managed to get at least some of these demands were met legally, if not always socially. But then they participated in the 1979 revolution in massive numbers, but they didn't put any demand of their own except democratic rights and a just society. But then when the revolution happened, within 2 weeks, all the rights they had struggled for since the constitutional revolution were basically evaporated. The compulsory hijab was introduced, the family law reformed, which was very modest. Nonetheless, it was canceled, and women couldn't be judges. A lot of the professions were closed to women. The facilities like sport and other thing was segregated. Which practically means because there weren't that much resources, women were excluded, but also that women could not participate, be inspectors in football matches. And that's to say many, this may not be a big thing, but football is a big thing in Iran. It has been since 1970s. And that's the largest public space, whether it was under the Shah or this regime that the Iranians see. If you wipe out women from that space, means you wipe out women from public space. So that was a very important gesture. So then also they introduced laws that were based on Sharia law, which meant the legal, not only the legal situation of women became half as much as men, like 2 women witnesses would be equal to 1, but blood money for women was half as much as men. This has important legal implication through laws. These are just giving you the quick example so that you would know. But the women's reaction in this situation, well, of course, they were shocked because especially the secular, the leftists, always assume the history can't go backwards. So, and progress is inevitable. And so that was shocking, not just for Iranian, but for a lot of, especially women's movements. They watched this with horror of what was happening in Iran. But nonetheless, women actually decided they're not going to leave the public space. So women remained in public. They launched the first demonstration against the revolutionary regime within less than a month of them coming to power. It was just organized the very next day. After it was said that hijab is compulsory for all women, regardless of whether they're Muslim or not. So even Armenian Jews, everyone else had to follow the suit. And so women just poured in the street. About 30,000 women came to the street without anyone organizing or without any organization behind it. Of course, they temporarily succeeded, but then the regime managed to introduce the veil anyway. But then the other issue for them was that they also continue to, due to seculars use human rights and other people used Islamic, like a lot of Islamic feminism in a way was introduced within Iran because a lot of their practicing Muslim wanted to try to introduce a more kind version of Islamic interpretation on women. So they remained there. They also remained. They also negotiated with more liberal wings of regime in various places. They participated in the election. They put their demands there. But in any way, I mean, there were occasions they were given a little bit more rights, but then were taken away. And so in a way, regime failed them all the time. These were more organized resistance. There were also those what we call collective common form of resistance, which was very widespread. To give you an example of that, well, sport was one example, but also the veil, because the veil was a very important ideological aspect of this Islamic regime. Was important. The idea was the black veil to cover head to toe, but then women started to develop their own way of wearing. Okay, they didn't choose to wear the beret. First they wore the mantle, and then they chose the colorful dress, especially ethnic. They modernized the ethnic clothes, and then they couldn't say it's Western, and mostly it was covered, but it was colorful, the colors that were forbidden, like orange, blue, yellow. In fact, for those of us who went back and forth to Iran during those times, it was very interesting to watch that kind of resistance. But the killing of Mahsa came on the back of really disastrous economic and environmental situation, and also the crackdown on normal freedom of, especially amongst the workers. The 2017-2019 was a big demonstration, a protest against the economic situation by workers in various parts of Iran. In fact, during that time, there were some 4,000 strikes and protestation. But 2019 especially was a bloody violence by the regime and the revolution. And then, so on the back of all these economic situation that was not very successful, the regime, in order to show that they are in charge and they are in control, they started to reimpose the restricted hijab. And that's where the death of Mahsa Amini was part of it. That was the whole series of other things happened during those few months. And then, of course, the Mahsa Amini's death was the last sort of it was the end of what people were putting up with. I just want briefly also say, I know the time is over, but I wanted to say there's a difference between this uprising that happened, we all watched, because this uprising, it happened from the margin, a smaller town, especially amongst the Kurdish group, then the Baluchis joined in, then other people. And the difference between this what I call uprising, it was that it was not organized in the same way. Like it was a huge demonstration, like 2009, we had millions of people in the street. So it was easy for the regime to basically bring their forces and suppress them. In this case, they were very small, like 1,000 or 10,000 or 500 in different parts. So they had to spread. So nonetheless, the human cost of this uprising so far, we know around 20,000 people are in jail. 500 people have been dead. 400 people have been blinded, regardless of other thing that was there. So and four people, at least 4 people that we know have been executed. So the cost has been a lot, but it hasn't been. But it has brought a kind of understanding that, okay, this regime is the most important thing. Is now that previously it was always negotiating with the regime in some way, but at this point they're not interested in negotiating or reform regime. They are really they want the regime to go. at all, because and also is a probably during all this since the mid-19th century to now, this is the first uprising that religion does not play a role. Like people do not want religion. What is interesting is that even secular, even practicing Muslims actually think a secular regime, they need a secular regime to save their religion from the state. So that's a major difference of, from say 1970 or even 1980 in that sense. I just want to also finish. So whether this is, people say, is this a revolution? Is it what it is? But I also feel the phenomenon of revolution is very complex. It's not something that we can, most of us think if the regime is a regime change and that some people go and in different groups, people come to power, that is a revolution. But in fact, those revolutions always end up to be unsuccessful. We saw what happened in 1979. A group of elite left, another group took over, but the structure didn't change. In Russian Revolution, which is the most maybe famous revolution in the world, people were fed up with the way Tsar was running the country, but they had a revolution. They ended up with Stalin. And Nicaragua was a similar thing with happened revolution in 1979 at the same time with the very leftist, very liberal group. But then when they came to power, now in fact it's one of the most dictatorial, oppressive regime in Latin America. So the change that has to happen in a revolution has different layers at the social and cultural level and a vision of society that is different. So what we have had in this uprising so far, we have that clearly that cultural social change has happened. We clearly people have different vision. They have passed of wanting religion to be part of politics. And of course, there's a vision of what they want, which is very important part of this. Another layer that is important. The vision that is yet to become true is that how the political structure is going to be placed and it's going to talk. So there's a lot of, yes, it's been a bit of subsided, the uprising, the street demonstration, but they have already conveyed, as far as I can see, they have conveyed their message to the Iranian, to the different generation, to the state in Iran, but also internationally. Now the last stage is to figure out how the political structure is going to change before the elite change. So what we don't want, or most Iranians do not want, is now once again we change one set of elite with another set of elite. So we ended up again with lack of democracy, lack of that social justice that in Iran for the last 120 years people have been demanding. So I stop here. I know, I hope I didn't go over my time too much, but there are a lot of other details that of course I didn't discuss, but I hope in the question and answer we can answer those things. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now next is Professor Thomas Junot.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be here with distinguished colleagues. So I will take for my 10 minutes a perspective that is consistent with my studies generally, which is more on the foreign policy analysis and the regional security angle. I will do a bit of a scenarios exercise, focusing on what could lie ahead, as opposed to the causes and the history, as Professor Hoodfar brilliantly showed. And I want to emphasize, in doing a scenarios exercise, we focus on probabilities, not necessarily desirability. There's obviously a huge difference. So 4 scenarios looking ahead. First scenario is a return to the status quo pre-September. And I should emphasize scenarios in something like the 6 to 12 months time frame, trying not to look much more beyond that. First scenario is a return to the status quo pre-September, when everything started. Basically, the regime wins through repression. Indiscriminate repression, targeted repression, repression in the cyber realm. We know very well now that this regime is very good at that, and it is not shy at doing that. I think that scenario is of a very low likelihood. Too many things have changed, including for reasons that were just mentioned. Scenario 2 is the regime wins in the sense that it survives, but only in a narrow sense. There is no return to the status quo. Too many things have changed. The wall of fear has not necessarily collapsed, but at least has been weakened. So in this scenario, even though the regime survives, you see ongoing low-level protests amid widespread repression. What this means is that eventually another explosion is inevitable and possibly a more violent one than what we're seeing right now. This is a very unstable scenario. It is also, I think, the most likely. Scenario 3 is an internal coup. The IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, take over. They see a window, they exploit the instability right now, and they seize power, building on years of expanding political, economic, and obviously military power in recent years and decades. In a narrow sense, I don't think this scenario is likely, even though a number of serious analysts were predicted as being more likely. I think the IRGC is just too entangled with the rest of the regime, the clerical elements, the non-clerical elements, for it to be really able to disentangle itself and seize power. That being said, there might be a diluted version of this scenario at some point in the future, perhaps at the time of succession, when the supreme leader dies. He is very old. There's been rumors of his ill health for a while, that the IRGC would exploit the very unstable moment of the transition to, if not necessarily completely seize power, at least intensify the increase in its power, perhaps by supporting a weaker candidate that would be more malleable. Scenario 4 is the revolution succeeds, i.e. the regime falls. Unfortunately, I think at this point that is a low probability scenario. The regime simply controls too much force at this point for this to be a plausible scenario, at least in the short to midterm. The regime has simply succeeded in preventing any strong opposition from emerging inside Iran. Indicators that we would have to see for this scenario to be of a higher likelihood: large-scale strikes, massive protests, defections within the regime, a breakdown in the chain of command in the security services or the military. We are simply not seeing that on a scale that would be necessary for this scenario to be likely. The major caveat to everything I just said in terms of these 4 scenarios and their probabilities is that we are all pretty bad at prediction and forecasting. By we, I mean academics, civil society, the media, activists. When I was in government, as you mentioned, we tried to do that. We were not especially good at it. So it's important to keep that in mind, to be humble. I think scenarios exercises are important because they help you try to map out where things could be going, but we have to be very humble. Now what I want to do is go back to these 4 scenarios and briefly try to map out what they could mean from a foreign policy perspective. So not that I want to neglect the more domestic angle, it's just that it's less the focus of my work. Return to the status quo pre-September. That is an unlikely scenario. And in any case, from an analytical perspective, it's somewhat less interesting because it would mean more of the same. So we know what it is. Scenario 2, the regime wins, but it is weakened domestically because, as we said, it is fragile. It is more vulnerable because the protests would continue even if on a lower scale. Historically, we've seen some regimes, when faced with that, the extent of domestic vulnerability like that, turn inward and become much more shy in terms of their foreign policy, much more inward focused. That's possible in the Iran case, but I don't think that's likely. What we know of the Islamic Republic's foreign policy, especially of the last 20 years, but before that, for that matter too, is that the core of its foreign policy is to externalize its domestic security, to seek to protect regime security by expanding its influence abroad, by supporting non-state armed groups in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Syria, and elsewhere, as a tool to protect regime security, as a way to tell especially its adversaries, the US, Israel, Saudi Arabia, if you pressure us too much, we will retaliate through these assets that we have in other countries. And that's the core of the Islamic Republic's foreign policy. So as it becomes weaker domestically, which I think is what we're going to see in 2023, we could actually expect them to double down on that approach to foreign policy, i.e. be more assertive, more aggressive in supporting groups like the Houthis or Hezbollah. In the case of Yemen, a country that I've looked at a lot in the last few years, What this means is that right now the Houthis, the rebels that Iran supports in northwestern Yemen, they are engaged in sort of peace talks with Saudi Arabia as we speak. I would expect Iran to push the Houthis to be even more intransigent as they already are in those talks. This, of course, makes the situation even more volatile than it already is in the region, not specifically domestically in Iran. Scenario 3, the internal coup. Suppose that I'm wrong and that it actually is more likely than I anticipated to be. This can be an interesting scenario. What does an IRGC-dominated or more IRGC-dominated Iran look like from a foreign policy perspective? Hard to say because it depends on the extent of the takeover of the IRGC. It's a matter of degrees in many cases. But I would expect to some extent more of the same, still an aggressive and ambitious regional power, but somewhat less ideological, especially as time goes by. I would expect still a fair bit of aggressivity towards Saudi Arabia, and neighbors definitely want to be influent in Iraq. But in relations with the US and Israel over time, I would expect somewhat more pragmatism. The fourth scenario, which is really the complicated one, from a foreign policy perspective, what happens if the revolution succeeds? Either I'm wrong in assessing that there's a low probability of that in the short term, or in the longer term, where I'm not even trying to predict anything, it happens at some point. And here is where the analysis gets really complicated. The idea that a constitutional democracy would emerge, we may wish for it, but again, I'm focusing on probabilities, not desirability. The idea that a constitutional democracy would have a much nicer foreign policy regionally and internationally is one possibility. I'm not dismissing it, but it is really not the only one. The scary possibility, too, of which we really don't like to talk about and of which I think we really should talk a lot about more from a policy planning perspective, is the scenario the revolution succeeds but is followed by collapse of state authority and civil war or chaos. And that is a pattern that we have seen in other circumstances. Of course, Iran is different in many ways, but it is not a scenario that we can dismiss. If anything, it is a scenario with a reasonably high likelihood, and it is a very dangerous one. Of course, it's a very dangerous one domestically for the Iranian population that has already suffered tremendously, but regionally, it is also a very difficult scenario. Three huge questions to finish to explore this scenario, and I'll be very quick on the questions to try to respect my time. Question one, in the scenario of the Islamic Republic collapses and the revolution succeeds scenario, what are the chances of the Islamic Republic being succeeded by a democracy? Over what period of time? And that's a really difficult question. And again, focusing on probability and not desirability, there tends to be, especially among exiled opposition groups, a bit of an assumption that that is more or less what will happen, more or less automatically. Unfortunately, from a probability perspective, we cannot take that as a given, especially in the short term. Second, what would a successor state's foreign policy be, even if it is democratic, assuming that it does come to happen? There is no doubt in my mind that a democratic constitutional republic, monarchy for that matter, who knows, post-Islamic Republic would be very ambitious and would equally want to be a dominant regional power in the region. It would use different means, arguably less aggressive ones, but it would still want to dominate Iraq. It would still want to be influential in the Persian Gulf and so on. Finally, and the last of my three questions, what can we do? What can Canada do? Of course, Canada, not that much, but Western countries in general, the US and the Europeans, what can we do to raise the odds of what should be the most desirable sub-scenario, which is a democracy succeeding the Islamic Republic? That's a really tough question. Keep in mind the history of well-intentioned and sometimes not so well-intentioned efforts by Western states to support democracy, which backfire. So rule number one has to be do no harm, which is far easier said than done. In practice, what does it mean, support for the opposition? Yes, but that's difficult from a logistical perspective, from a security perspective. Do you put them at risk if you engage with them? Can you provide some elements in the opposition technology to better communicate with each other in a world where the Islamic Republic is extremely repressive in the cyber realm. Yes, but again, how do you know who to give it to? How do you make it? How do you bring it to them from a logistical perspective? And so on. These are extremely difficult questions, but important ones that I expect in 2023 and perhaps beyond, we will have to ask ourselves in Canada, in the EU and elsewhere, but to which there are no obvious or simple answers. Thank you.
Je voudrais simplement vous dire qu'il y a la traduction simultanée si vous la voulez. Donc, n'hésitez pas à aller chercher des écouteurs. Elle est là pour vous. Alors, s'il y a des personnes dans la salle qui souhaiteraient avoir la traduction simultanée, allez-y, allez chercher votre écouteur. Merci.
Merci. Thank you very much. Mina Favar. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So what I try to say in my presentation is from my point of view as a feminist and as a woman who has born and raised in Iran after revolution. And part of my point of view and what I'm trying to say at this moment is, of course, influenced by my my living and what I experimented myself in Iran. Since this revolution has started in September, out of after the murder of Kurdish young girl Mahsa Jina Amini on September 16th, while she was in custody of morality police for her improper hijab, we questioned this, and everyone sensed that this time is different. And we've questioned if this is a revolt, as Dr. Hoodfar mentioned that, or a revolution. To me, what I'm saying here is that I consider this as a revolution, and to me is a feminist revolution, and here's why. The women life freedom is an unprecedented in its scope. There were many things that we haven't seen before. Yet, as it's a new thing, and there are a lot of newbies in this revolution and this uprising, to me, is the continuity of the other movements. And this is the continuous of the uprising of women, not only from 44 years ago, but since 100 years ago, as Dr. Hoodfar mentioned, the history of women movements in Iran. First, this is a secular uprising. Since the revolution, at the dawn of the revolution, the first law that the regime has established was concerning women and women bodies, like the mandatory hijab and the marriage legal age. Islamic Republic wants to keep the society pious in Iranian women's caste. That's why, to me, secularism is first of all the question and priority of women more than men. To me, that the revolution, the Islamic revolution was also the base of establishment of Islamism in Iran. And that's when they started to rule the juridic system of the country by Sharia law. And for the Islamists, of course, we know that the first Muslim were first victims of Islamism. Wherever in the world that there were Islamist fundamentalism, it's hand in hand with patriarchy and with neoliberal capitalism. We have gone when the uprising started. We have gone from the contestation of the way contestation to the mandatory hijab and veil, to a rejection of Islamism. It's entirely. The other sign that we've seen was a sign of a secular that people wanted this time was different, was that there is no single Islamic slogan in this uprising, not a single one. Even though we've seen in the Green movement in 2009 that they're referring to the government, to the politicians at the time, and they were asking the questions. This time, there is no question, and they want the regime change. That's clear. There is no. At the time, we remember that they were Allahu Akbar, as at the night time they were on the roof and they were shouting Allahu Akbar. This time, not a single slogan. They just want the regime change, and that's pretty clear. The other signs for me that it says that it's a feminist revolution is that this time the women, even though it was led by women, this revolution, but they included men from the first days of the uprising. We're seeing that men were not protecting as just because they're women and maybe they cannot protect themselves, but they were there to protect them as they were giving the stage to women to be the leader and to shout and chant their slogans. So the inclusion of men, this is one of the unseen thing in Iranian uprising since the revolution until now. The other thing is cultural pluralism, that we see that it's like it started by this death of Mahsa Amini, which was Kurdish, and the first cities in Iran that were involved were the Kurdish cities. But then in Tehran and then in Baluchistan, which is almost every Friday now, the Baluchi people, and we see how they are hand in hand, and if there is a repression, if there is a severe crackdown in one on ethnical minority, other part of the country, they are there as a solidarity gestures for others. So this is new, the cultural pluralism. The other thing is that gender inclusivity. We see that for the first time that the LGBT communities, they are visible. They make themselves visible and heard in the public sphere of the country, even regardless of the risks that they're taking. They're so brave, and they publish their pictures, and they don't hide their sexual orientation. This was new. The other thing was that we see solidarity between women. I am always inspired by the theory of Benedict Anderson, an imagined community, and I think that in this, after Islamic revolution, as women, Iranian women had a common enemy and had the common cause. They created an imagined community, and as in solidarity, regardless of their class, socioeconomical class, their ethnicity, origin, and their educational level, their belief, religious belief. In this, they are together. The other unseen character of this revolution or this uprising is that there is no leader, of course. There has advantages and inconvenience for that. The positive part of that, this uprising without leader, is that it's like it has many arms, so it's stronger. It encourages people who are participants in this revolution, in either inside or outside of Iran, to not leave the responsibility of reflections to one single person, We've saw, for example, as an example, and that makes this movement, this uprising more mature. For example, the first slogan of the revolution, as you know, it's woman, life, freedom. And some days after, some people started to chant man, homeland, and prosperity, as it continues as to rhymes with woman, life, freedom. And we've seen on the social media that there was right away a backlash that just leave the women to be for the first time the leader of the revolution, and why you want to just make it for yourself. This is for the first time, it's not about you. It's for women. And because we've seen we were under the oppression for 44 years. So there were discussions on the social media everywhere. There were a group in favor of this slogan, and there were others against it. And soon after, we saw that government itself, the regime, used this man, homeland, and prosperity slogan as their own slogan. And how mature, that was the sign of how mature this uprising became. And I see that as one of the reason it derives from, because it has no single leader, or not just a group of leaders, that people take the responsibility. It's their own. So it triggers the sense of agency for everyone that we have to do. And this is our revolution. And we don't want to re-experiment the revolution, the Islamic revolution in 1979. That they want to be different, to make it in a different way. The negative side of the revolution without having a leader, of course, there are many, but one of them for me is that it makes the confusion, as now some people might interpret that, oh, that got calm, and it's going to be calm. And maybe the reason that we don't see much protest in the street was a disappointment part for people who are witnessing it. But as soon as something comes as an occasion, like in Shia culture and tradition, 7 days and 40 days after the death of someone, they have there is a ceremonial funeral to remember the person and go and see the family, without even having a call out for a protest. We saw that for martyrs of the revolutions, every single time people go themselves to either to the under grave or to the parents or to the family's home to see, and just to show their solidarity with them. The bravery and the courage of Iranian women is really inspirational. We saw that they perilled their life by going out and protest and facing repression and torture. I hope that in the Q&A part we can talk about the reports coming out of the prison for the rape cases. But this is the first time we see that how brave Iranians, and how it's inspirational for all the women in the world. I believe that this freedom, our freedom, is only possible through our unity and the sisterhood, no matter where on the planet we live. And as Rosa Luxemburg quoted, that if there is a freedom, there is a sign, freedom somewhere, as if it would be the freedom for everyone. That was my presentation.
Thank you, Professor Mojab.
Good evening. Thank you very much for being here, and also thank you to all my colleagues here. And thanks so much to the organizers, really. I mean, I really appreciate all the effort for bringing us here. Stunned with fear and hope, has been my mode of emotional being and thinking since September 2002. Stubbornly, hope remains the only option, though fear of intensified state violence, executions, more arrests, and tortures is persistently present. The presence of the absence of a clear future path to enable women life freedom, Jin Jian Azadi, is distressing. The contradiction of fear and hope unsettles me. Only I wait there to be settled in my revolutionary dreams. Bear with me as I will step into the past to arrive in present and try to unravel these contradictions to comprehend how the state murder of Jinnah sparked a revolutionary storm. Summer of 1983 is the one that I still feel intensely. I vividly remember the moment when I heard, "Be happy," shouted a young, bony-looking Baluch man. "You're safe now, you're free." And he continued, "We passed the Iranian border." Deep sadness settled in my body. My stomach clenched. To calm my husband and my one-year-old son, I swallowed my fears and faked the joy of freedom. I was leaving and forced to exile when their suppression of the Islamic State, after they came into power, of the dissidents started. That's why that I don't call the 1979 revolution the Islamic Revolution. It was not an Islamic revolution. It was a secular democratic revolution with the Islamist forces violently took power. We were being smuggled out and were crossing the barren lands through the corner borders of Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran. We climbed mountains, rode motorcycles, and walked. Nature, frontiers, and border guards imposed the means and modes of crossing. It is the burning heat of August 1983 in that desert that I still feel on my skin. In that astonishing moment of nothingness and the loneliness of loss and defeat, I desired darkness. I wanted the sun and its beaming heat to disappear and let my cold heart leave its hope. My life is interlocked with the 1979 revolution of Iran. Above all, I'm still a living witness to the rise and fall of the last populist democratic revolution of the 20th century. A revolution that has been written about extensively, though its history remained to be retold, especially by the rebellious Kurdish women and the left. I belong to the generation of women targeted by the both secular and theocratic regimes. Our bodies were inscribed, tested, dressed, undressed, shaped, and shaped as part of the projects of nation-state building. In my teens, I was modernized, all of these are in quotations, educated and taught of independence as an urban middle class belonging to the dominant nation of Persia. Soon after finishing my college, I was sent to the US on a government scholarship to become a technocrat and learn to redesign the Iranian higher education system modeled after the American system of university governance. However, it was the ongoing era of 1960s student movements, especially the anti-war, civil rights, and feminist activism on the campus of University of Illinois, which excited me and animated my life. In those movements, I discovered myself, my people, Iran, the whole world, my passion, my future. I rebelled against myself and relations around me. I became a revolutionary feminist in love with humanity. The rise of revolutionary tide pulled me back to Iran, like thousands of other Iranian students abroad. I returned home to join in rebuilding post-monarchical Iran into a democratic society, as vague as it sounds now and more than 40 years ago. The dream days were cut short, too short indeed for me to even have a chance to blink at any particular moment of it. For 40 years, I have carried the heavy burden of the unfulfilled dream of justice, freedom, and the lifting of the tyranny of the state off the back of people. In my resettling and rerouting struggle in exile, even as an intellectual, I have been discreet about the pain and joy of these unsettling years of resistance. I don't know how to express it fully. Maybe it is the anger of a revolution stolen from people, the controlling, disciplining, and punishing of women's bodies, sexualities, the suppression of thoughts and ideas, and the suppression of nationalities, all of them in Iran, especially the Kurds. Let me repeat this sentence that has been repeated at least a million times. Jina Mahsa Amini, a 20-year-old Kurdish woman of Iran, was arrested for improper veiling by the morality police and was brutally killed while in custody on September 16, 2022. Let's think about this sentence. This brief headline news contains three significant elements of the Islamic State violent oppression of 43 years. Gender, improper veiling. Kurds, Jina, the suppression of the Kurds and national minorities. And the state machinery of violence, morality police. Jina was not the first Kurdish woman to face the brutality of Islamic State. Millions, you're not hearing it wrong, millions of women and men have faced the violence of the state repeatedly and continuously over the last 4 decades. The Interior Minister, for example, reported that in 2014, 220,000 women were taken to police stations to sign a statement that they will not violate the compulsory veiling law. In the same year, close to 4 million women and men received quote-unquote warnings and quote-unquote guidance because they failed to follow the Islamic dress code and or defy publicly regulated morality code ranging from men's hairstyle and tight pants to women's makeups, bodily posture, loud laughters in public, and those who appear to be transgender or members of the LGBTQ communities. Jina was not the first Kurdish woman to face the brutality of the Islamic State. The Islamic theocracy is like the Pahlavi monarchy, a unitary state rooted in Persian national superiority in terms of the language, the Shia sect of Islam, and also culture, and rejects the idea of self-rule or autonomy for national minorities. Jina's name is parenthesized, erased, and in most cases, you know, when there is a slogan, say her name, it's Mahsa, is being repeated, and Jina is diminishing as the movement is going on. And as is argued by several Kurdish feminist scholars, the erasure of Jina's Kurdish name and identity and dismissing the likely relationship of her Kurdishness to the fatal violence that she was subjected to reveals deeper patterns of erasure that Kurds have experienced in modern Iran. What is the pattern? Kurdish territory is highly militarized zone. economic and cultural suppression, securitization, assimilationist politics towards Kurdish language and culture, while at the same time that the Kurds constitute 10% of the population, close to 50% of the political prisoners, and majority of the people that are executed are Kurds. For example, Zahra Mohammadi, a 30-year-old Kurdish language teacher, was arrested in 2020 and sentenced for 10 years for teaching Kurdish language to children. Her sentence later was reduced to 5 years starting in January 8, 2022. Zainab Jalanian is the longest serving Kurdish women political prisoner actually in the entire Middle East, not only in Iran. What is interesting, and that probably a lot of analysts do not pay attention to this fact, that Zainab Jalanian, Zahra Mohammadi, and then also Farzad Kamangar, a 23-year-old teacher, much beloved teacher, journalist, human rights activist, and with him, Shireen Alamhole, 29 years old, that both of them, Farzad Kamangar and Shireen, they were executed on May 9th, 2010. They were all have sympathies or officially political relationship with Party of Free Life of Kurdistan, PAJAK. That also there are anecdotes that Shireen actually before her execution wrote on the walls in the Evin prison, Jen Jian Azadi, women, life, freedom. So these are all of the sort of thinking about the notion of women, life, freedom. We have to pay attention to the struggle of Kurdish people and especially Kurdish women. I was Gina's age when the compulsory veiling was proclaimed, participated in the March 8, 1979 protest, was beaten, shoved out of the bus. So it is the compulsory veiling marked the beginning of the continuous rise of the political suppression in Iran. So it was after that the rise of the suppression and also because of my activism in the women's movement, that like many hundreds and thousands of other left activists of the time, we left for Kurdistan. So I went in the early 80s to the mountains of Kurdistan in order to continue and join the movement for the Kurdish movement for autonomy. And I also became as one of the first women to join the first cadre of women Peshmergas, women fighters in Iran. Gina brought these memories back for me. And also when fall term of 2022 was supposed to be like any other term, it turned out to be differently. Gina's family made the crime of the state public. This is very important. This act that the daring family announced that what has happened is very important. And we always have to remember that, because there were many other women before that this happened to them, and then the family kept it as a secret. That's why the city of Saqqez and then the entire Kurdistan rose up. And then the women, life, freedom was echoed nationally and instantly was reverberated around the world. The media images of young women, beautiful and daring, made me restless. I devoured every image on social media. And one day in October 2022, I caught myself scanning the crowd intensely in search of Leila, Sahar, Maryam, Ziba, Setare, or Tala of 40 years ago. We were in the crowd. We were carrying signs demanding equality for women. All of these names that I mentioned, they were executed later in the 80s in Iran. We were carrying signs demanding equality for women, down with imperialism, down with dictatorship, free political prisoners, bread, jobs, freedom. I was reliving the past in my present, and I was searching for myself in the crowd. This time, it was not a call for death to or down with. It was a call for women, life, freedom, and life in its most expansive meaning. Every day, for months in the early 1980s, thousands of us were on the streets demanding equality, freedom, and democracy. 4 decades later, a new generation is still demanding the same on the same streets. The images of young women battling security forces, dancing to burn their veils, or even their sheer presence on the streets in every protest songs, in short recorded videos, disrupted the image of Muslim Iranian women. "They look like us," exclaimed a student to me. And I was asked, is what we see is true? Women look like so un-Islamic. "This was me 40 years ago," I replied to the student. "I was the generation who wanted change, to end the misery of millions of people, for millions of people. But we were robbed of that revolution. Our naivete and idealism cost the lives of our comrades who were executed in the 80s or forced into exiles in thousands. The international community, this obscure notion, kept silence on all these atrocities for the last 43 years. This generation of women reinstituted my lost sense of pride. My dignity is being restored. And this is also the heart of Jen Jian Azadi, Women, Life, Freedom. But the questions remain for us to think through. Why Iran, and by which I mean mostly the people of Iran, the struggle of Iranian people against the Islamic regime, is so misconstrued? Why so much misinterpretation by Iranian, non-Iranian scholars, and more specifically by feminists? Most of the reconstruction, although coming from diverse theoretical and political positions, arrive at the same conclusions. Iranians are constructed as inherently religious. And religion and Islam becomes the sort of the engine of the historical analysis. That is, they desire an Islamic state. But this Islamic state could or should be reformed to become moderate and has the potential to be reformed. Every creative act of women to resist and defy the gender apartheid regime has been analyzed as this dichotomy or these notions of agency, subjectivity, and hence the notion of Islamic feminism. These are all sort of not in a way have these explanations are there in order not to directly address the totality of the structure of power. Often, my Marxist feminist analysis has been deemed too state-centrist, too structuralist, with a proclivity to undermine the agency, subjectivity, autonomy, or power of other social actors. In the current theoretical privileging of self and fragmentary approach to self-society, oppression, exploitation, and in particular, dehistoricization of identity and dematerialization of culture and religion, I argue that at least if we start deeply looking at the meaning and the historical roots of women's life freedom, we have a lot to think about. And I hope that we can continue that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for sharing such personal details with us. So now we are going to take some questions for our speakers. So the first questions will be by Farinas Basmetchi, who is an Iranian PhD candidate at the Feminist and Gender Studies Institute here at the University of Ottawa. And her research interests include gender and sexuality, social mobilization, content analysis, and digital media. She also holds a PhD in sociology from the University of North Texas, where she focused on online social activism. Her dissertation focuses on sexuality and sexual violence against female graduate students in Iran and in Canada. Farinas.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Hello, everyone. First of all, I want to thank the discussant for taking time to shed light on different aspects of this movement. I have two questions. As the title of the roundtable tells us, the Women Life Liberty movement has been taking place in different locations in Iran, and people are participating in it regardless of their ethnicities, religion, class, gender, or sexual orientation. How would you assess the diversity of people involved in the movement? How does this serve the process of change in Iran?
Who would like to?
Well, I can.
No, I think that who would like to respond to the first?
Well, I think probably Shahrzad can also answer, but to me, the inclusion of diversity, the recognition of that is the sign of maturity of the movement. In the previous uprising or the huge demonstrations, this was not there, in part because those kind of demonstrations like 2009 was still negotiating with the government. It was negotiating with the state to open up a little bit more space for democratic rights. But in some way that has passed, is become, the situation has passed, and therefore the new situation is what is, because they're looking beyond this state, the recognition of diversity, the fact that the differences between different regions, not just in terms of ethnicity, but also in terms of development, environmental policies that are actually quite important has been important in terms of political uprising, complaint against the state during the last 15 years. So those are very important points. And I think it also shows this, one of the factors that I said is a cultural and social change. The recognition of diversity and vision of how this diversity is going to be part of the whole is a very important part of this movement, and which we hadn't seen in the same way and so nationally throughout. Maybe some segments of political forces were very conscious of it, but now I think nationally people are conscious of this diversity, which is an important progressive movement in terms of now people think of not us as a Persian or Kurds and all this, but as a nation of diversity. Unity in diversity is an important aspect that many people discuss it also in social media.
Anybody else would like to address Her next question. Is that?
Yeah, you know, this notion of diversity is very different. The function of it in Iran is highly politicized, and it comes on the last 40 years of a very deliberate project of the state in terms of uneven development and then also very unequal treatment of the majority of the national minorities, Arabs, Kurds, and Baluchs in particular. And so, and as I said, the notion that this whole movement is started from Kurdistan has also a history. After the suppression of women and the imposition of the veiling, which was the first act of the Islamist forces coming to power in Iran, they did it. They immediately started attacking the Kurds. And it's very interesting to note that after the Kurds, they immediately started attacking the students and closure of the universities. So we have a sequence that happened at the beginning of the revolution: suppression of women, the Kurds, and the students. And exactly that sequence happened in this recent uprising. I think that the question of the unity is also related, that this movement became out of the sort of a center-based Tehran, major city, cosmopolitan cities based type of the grievances of the people. The people in the smaller towns and cities suffered economically tremendously in the last 5-6 years in particular, and with the COVID. The environmental destructions, the questions of water, shortages of fuel, and inflations, and unemployment, high unemployment, the sort of the increasing rise of unemployment among the youth. And Iran is not different than the rest of the region, that the population, more than 50% of the population in Iran are under 30. That's why that they call the Middle East as a very young sort of a region of the world. So with the unemployment, high rates of high level of education, but no employment and jobs, no economic prosperity. So the grievances, it comes from smaller places and outside of the center too. But the question of the unity is a highly debatable and political. Yes, there are uprisings everywhere, but the country is not united in terms of especially what is next after the fall of this regime, or when this regime is going to fall. And I think that the more sort of we are there is a sort of with the rise of the increasing of the violence of the state against the resistance movement, more arrests, tortures, and executions. You see that it is very deep and important questions that our people are facing with, and challenges that are there. It's a very complex, very difficult circumstances, very difficult political conditions that it is happening. But one thing is sure, and I think that I agree with the notion that the Iranian calendar has been marked by September 16, 2022. So from now on, we have after September 22, pre-September 22. So that change has definitely happened, and that has been marked on the Iranian calendar. But then what is going to happen? It's as we heard, it's really complex. But I really think that there is a standoff between the Iranian people and the Islamic State. However, the fate of this brutal regime is not only about the Iranian people and this regime, has important geopolitical consequences. It has huge ramifications for the region, but also for what is happening with the rise of authoritarian regimes everywhere, the rise of fascism in Europe. That's why that we have these many scenarios and don't know what's going to happen. And that's why that we all have to pay attention to what is happening in Iran. It will have ramifications for all of us, wherever we are.
Thank you. Professor Junot, did you want to add something?
I want to add
yes,
something.
Go, please.
Just for the diversity, I want to mention that the age-wise of the protesters is between 16 to 22. We have to mention that how young they are. And for women and men are equally participants of the protestation. Ethnically wise, we see that it's all of the ethnical, like the majority of ethnical origins in Iran, they are participating. And for that, what is different this time is that for the question of the class, economical class, of course, as Dr. Mojab mentioned, that now the majority of the middle class of Iran has melted because of the sanctions, because of the after COVID, because of the unemployment, but since up to green movements, we saw that mostly, if I just talk about women, they were mostly middle-class women that they were part of the movements and uprising. But this time we see that most of the martyrs and people who are actively protesting are in the public sphere. They are part of the low-income, very low-income and poor families. The two at least out of the 4 young men who have been executed by the government were simple workers, and were from low-income families. I had to mention that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next question is from another PhD candidate at the Department of Sociology at the University of Ottawa, Roudabe Derani, whose research is on studying modes of governance of sexuality in contemporary Iran.
Hello, everyone, and thank you all for your comments and the points you shared. And so my question is that there are some terms used by various commentators to describe this movement or the type of movement it is. One of the most common terms we hear, for example, is feminist. Some other terms include modern, secular, or even a revolution. But I would like to know if there are any widely used terms about this movement that you are reluctant to use, and why?
Well, I just say one word. We often, when we talk with other friends and colleagues who have been involved, we use the word womanist, which is the translation of Banuyan, which is a term used in the end of the 19th century by the women's movement of the time, which is the exact translation of feminism, but womanist is a little bit more expansive. But of course, that's not the terminology that is very common in the academic literature, so you don't hear it, but you do hear it amongst the other people. But whether the point is that it was like, I think all the papers explain whether we call it feminist or anything else, the fact is a very woman-centered movement, and that is I think that's what we have to pay attention to. And in some way, because women, regardless of whether you're Kurdish or Baluchis or Persian or middle class or upper class or low income, women across the segment of society are the most oppressed in this regime within their own class. So in a way that creates a sense of unity and the sense of belonging to the community that this imagined community that Shahrzad was talking about. So yes, they are different, the demands may be different, but their oppression, what they have in common is a sort of oppression that they all can relate to one another. And that's not new, that has been, people have been writing about it since the 90s. Thank you.
Anybody else would like to address the question?
We have one question online. We have a few questions online, so if it's okay with you, I'm going to read one. But if you do have questions, please don't hesitate. We have a microphone for the audience too. So I'm going to read one question here from Pavazian, graduated scholar. So. As research shows, revolutions often start with women occupying the front line and the patriarchal systems taking their space. Do you think this is happening in Iran right now? Is that why, as we go, we are hearing less about women's life freedom? If not, then why?
Who would like to start?
Well, I think in Iran anyway, I think from the tobacco movement and other women have been part of the movement. And one of the problems, as I mentioned earlier, is that women never put their own gender-specific demands forward, except the present movement. And I think that makes a difference. And that also, this assumption that if democracy comes, then everybody will be equal. And since we didn't have democracy, the reason why women were pushed back was because of lack of democracy. This no longer women who are activists are buying that perspective that we fight for democracy, and then democracy comes, then we all would benefit. But the fact is, democracy hasn't come, but also in the most democratic countries in the world, also democracy hasn't delivered equality. So I think that's another important lesson that I think women have learned, not just in Iran, but across the world.
Thank you. Anyone else wants to respond?
Yeah, I think that my response will be also to the previous question, that what are the other concepts that has not been used. I really think that it is very important that we understand clearly that what is this state that we are talking about. The Islamic State is not an abstract notion of a bunch of clergies ruling the country. It is, and I'm going to name it in this order, and then we have to keep it that mind that it is coming in like that. It's a patriarchal, theocratic, capitalist, highly militarized, securitized state. This is how we need to think about this state. And therefore understand that what colossal power we are facing with. That has the other sort of a layer of complexity to it is that all these that I mentioned, it has regional, national, regional, international implications. And therefore, for us to think about what is the possible is that going back to also thinking, adding to our responsibilities. If the bourgeois liberal democracy of the West has not achieved women, and at this particular moment, we are facing the retreat of those rights of women, the ban of abortion in the US, and the rise of the right-wing sort of authoritarian fascism in Europe, it all retreats of the achievements of women that has been fought strongly for the last 60 years. If that also is failing, what are our options? And what is the uprising of women and the Jina revolution in Iran is telling us needs to happen? This is what we need to think about. And I know that it is not an easy thing for us to have a quick answer for it. And really thinking about it and having conversations and debate about it is very, very important and crucial.
I want to add a little bit to that. When in other meetings I've been talking, people say, what's the difference between the international community reacted to 2009 and present movement? I just feel in 2009, international community, especially feminist community, showed sympathy. But today, some 12 years later, they show solidarity, which is that it shows because they have now realized once the right you have, it can be taken away. Something that I think in 2009 was not quite understood in the same way in the West. And I think that should be also part of the discussion, that the problem is much more universal when it comes to the women question. And I deliberately don't use gender question. I think it's a women question in this sense. Thank you.
Only one, because Hamas said that I just say something about it. I mean, the 2009 was the internal factional governments, one faction against the other faction. And that has been over the last 40 years, the problems in terms of the how you take a position within this fractured factional struggle that it is going on in Iran. And the factional was the one that were thinking that they're about the reform from within of the system. So international communities is looking at what is going on. This is the factional sort of a faction within the government that is trying to reform itself. It wasn't a revolutionary idea to the extent that we see it right now. The demands was the reform, not the revolution at all. That is huge difference.
Would anybody else would like to address this question? Should we ask if there is
someone that
yes,
wants to ask a question.
please. Working?
Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. I have a specific question for Professor Juno. Hope I'm pronouncing that wrong. So speaking about probabilities and desirabilities, I'm wondering if this is not a question, I'm just wondering if we had this conversation early in September 2020, would we be able to say that there's going to be this revolutionary moment in Iran? So connecting that to foreign policy, and when we are talking about foreign policy, I assume we talk about the Canadian foreign policy, especially in the region, and connecting these probabilities and desirabilities. I felt that we are talking about a passive situation that Canada has to respond. And in this passive situation of status quo or whatever development that is happening in the region, and we have some really problematic involvements with the region, such as arming Saudi Arabia or supporting some other groups, especially like supporting Turkey. Well, in the last couple of years, it has leveled down. But in general, I'm wondering, what would it take for Canadian foreign policy, or for a notion, a strategy of foreign policy that would take the people's struggle for self-determination, for justice, for equality as the base, and not looking at probabilities of how things are going to work out, and based on that, we design our policies. Thank you.
That's a difficult question. Thank you for that. There's multiple ways to answer that, and I'll try to focus on one. I don't think these are mutually exclusive, neither in theory nor in practice. Canadian foreign policy in the Middle East, and in general, for that matter, takes into consideration a number of variables. You may seem to be uncomfortable with the choice of words that I use in terms of probabilities and variables, but I think that's a way of conceptualizing foreign policy as it is. The reality is that the number one factor, if you don't like the word variable, that shapes our foreign policy in the Middle East and elsewhere is our relationship with the US. It is what it is. We are massively dependent on the US from a commercial perspective, from a security perspective, from an intelligence perspective, and so on. So what shapes our decisions in the Middle East in particular and elsewhere is what would allow us to position ourselves favorably with the US. And not the struggles of peoples in the region. And I say that in a descriptive way. I'm not endorsing or criticizing. That's just how it is. And we may disagree with that. When Canada decided to participate in the mission in Iraq, Canada framed it as a way of fighting against the evil of the Islamic State, of supporting the people of Iraq and so on. That wasn't untrue. But the reality is that the main reason why we were there was because the US was looking for allies and we could contribute, and we were there for mostly that reason. So if you turn the radar back to Iran, is the struggle of the people of Iran the main consideration driving Canadian foreign policy? Describing the reality, I don't think it is right now. I think it's one factor, but it's not the main one. Again, Canada looks at this through the prism of, managing our relationships with allies and so on. This under the current government. The previous government, the Harper government, was, I think, more driven by considerations of democratization in the region, though I don't think it was as much as it claimed to be. But I would say that it was more than the current one. And again, you can agree or disagree with that. Could things change? The reality, and call me cynical, and I think that would be accurate, is I don't think it will change very much. I think that's the model that we work with, and the actual struggle of people for justice is not the main priority as it is. And what could you do personally to make that change? To be honest, I'm not sure.
I'll read another question and then you'll be able to speak from the audience online. So it's Philip that is saying, thank you for such amazing perspectives. How much does the current economic employment and corruption play into the current uprising? And are these the catalysts that are bringing people together?
Would like to start?
Well, I'm not a specialist, but I think if you look at the economic situation, the inflation is at almost 50%. It's between 45, 47%, which is the high in 1 year. That's the highest inflation we have had since the Islamic Republic. Unemployment and underemployment is extreme. A lot of people with the skill and knowledge are unemployed. The other problem is the fact that Revolutionary Guard controls so much of the economy. So the fact that we don't see so many people coming to the street is partly because those who work within all these economic context which belongs to Revolutionary Guard coming out in the street has an extra cost for them because they may lose their job and all of these things. And also under the Shah, I know that previous regime, when the oil workers were on a strike, they were still receiving their salaries. As much as we criticize that regime, but in this situation, even when they work, they don't receive their salaries because the government doesn't have money. So it's like the situation is much more complex for general public to come out because of the way military is controlling, not just through violence, physical violence, but it's also economic violence. And that's one of the major concerns for people who work in those segments of economy.
In the recent indexation of misery in the world, Iran is on top of that index, and that is measured by unemployment, poverty line, and as well as the general well-being of people. The rate of suicide and also self-immolation of women is on the rise. Between 2014 to now, the rate of suicide has increased by 44%. And this rate among the national minorities is twice the rate of the entire nation. There are, again, Iran is not an exception in the sense that majority of more than 50% of students enrolled in higher education are women. And that is this year actually for Iran went to 60%. But when it comes to employment, they are only less than 10% of employment with the higher education and degree. So the level of the poverty and the rising line of poverty line is really incredible pressure on emotional, mental stress that has been created among the people. It's rising very rapidly.
I want to add something as well. So as I mentioned before, that the age, the middle age of the protesters are between 16 to 22, and the power, what actually changed the point of view of these protesters is that they don't see any future. And in their reports, and when I see their comments on the social media, in the discussion, people in Iran say that if we don't have anything to lose, so that changes their point of view here to give them the rage, a collective rage, to all of them, that now that they are in the street, is that for once they have the chance to change something in their lives. That maybe if we see from this angle, that could this unemployment and this poverty, and because the government, the privatization of the big industries and agro businesses, and the reason that the workers, even they go on a strike or no, but they don't receive their salaries. It gives them so much rage that they have to do something just to be able to live. So the threat of killing them and the death doesn't change a thing, because in any way they don't see any life for them. Just to be able to live, they need to go through this repression and severe crackdown.
Thank you very much. There was a question in the back, please.
Yes. Hi. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
My question is actually for Dr. Majab. Thank you very much for your talk and speaking to the Kurdish roots of Zinjan Azadi. My question is about solidarity. You said one of your students said these students look like us. Who is the us of your class? I mean, I look at my students and I don't know what would constitute an us, I mean, is it the way they're dressed? If it were not that, would it not be another sort of Orientalist, projection on them? So what is this us, and how are we approaching solidarity with other women? I mean, other parts of it.
Thank you. This is a very important question. Again, a lot of things about this movement takes me back to reflect on this last 40 years, because as I said, it has been part of my life. And intellectually, my scholarship is all related to that too. So it has never left me. I remember when I arrived back in the US, I was shocked by the notion that out of a sudden, I became a Muslim woman. 1979, when I left the US, I was in a very nascent women's studies program. We were studying women in the Middle East. We were studying Arab women. We were reading about the region, African women, and so on and so forth. Never a Muslim woman, never coming from a Muslim majority countries. We need to ask ourselves, what happened? And this is my answer is that the defeat of the 1979 revolution in Iran has its mark on the world. This identitarian base, culturalizing the people in different parts of the region, otherizing, orientalizing. We never call Christian Muslim, Christian majority countries. It's only the East, it's only the Middle East that it is Muslim majority countries. So when that happens, then it means that over all these years, this us, them, this East-West, this democracy that it is only belonging to the West, and the people in the rest of the world and the Middle East, they even don't have the intellectual capacity, or it doesn't exist in their histories, the ideas, the desires for democracy, for justice. And when you see the women of Iran is constantly veiled and the entire identity, and that is exactly what the Islamic State doing. The cultural identity and representation of this state are women, and the veiled women. And what do women do? The government, the official government women are always totally covered in black veiling and long veiling. But what the women do, as Hamas said, they come out in colors. And then we argue that that this is, we theorize that as a mode of resistance only. But we need to go beyond that. And so my students, when they see that these women are burning their veils, and they come out, they are beautiful, they look like everybody here, they are surprised because their image of the Muslim women and the Middle East is this passive women, always covered with no agency and no subjectivity in making meaning for their own lives. This has been the dominant sort of a media narrative of the Middle East. I know that there are, but also the other part of it is that Muslim students that cannot comprehend why the women are burning their veils. So what we have missed in explaining is the notion of the state control of women's bodies and sexualities. That there is a difference. What they are doing by that, it's not about burning Islam as a religion. It's burning not having the freedom of choice. It is protesting about the control and the freedom. But also for Iran, it gets more complicated because the question of the oppression of women's bodies and the control of their sexualities, it also translates into the control and suppression of freedom of thinking, the freedom of expression and ideas, and it goes on and on and on. Therefore, majority of writers, journalists, artists, filmmakers are the ones that are in prison. Think about it. The entire Middle East has the largest number of women political prisoners in the world. And when we think about what is the notion of political prisoners, it means that they are fighting against the state. They are targeting the state. That is their protest. And that's why that they are in prisons. That begs the world to build the solidarity with this movement, with the women, especially of these movements, against this brutality of the state. We cannot get the state off the hook. We have done it the feminist body of knowledge who produced and theorized the reformability of Islamic State and political Islam, they have to learn that it is not reformable. We've passed that stage. This is the call for solidarity. This is the call for the importance and the significance of Janjian Azadi. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Zaki, you have a comment. We have another question online, so if you can make it short, time is running. So
thank you, Minister. I have a question for you also, Dr. Mujab. Thank you. Just to continue on this idea of thought, because one of the things that struck me personally is that a lot of academic institutions in Canada didn't want to have a conversation about what's happening in Iran. And the idea was that if we're discussing what's happening in Iran, then we are increasing hate against Muslims and we're putting Muslim students in danger. And you mentioned the struggles within feminist scholarship, about associating Iranians with Islam, but also Arabs of Arab origin as well. And where Arab scholarships also suffering with the same thing. What can we do to fight this?
To fight exactly what?
To try to have spaces, conversations, like how can we try to explain that, that there is another version than the version that is supported, funded, and dominated by political Islam that is getting increased in academia in Canada?
I really think that, in most of our theoretical analysis, which what I call, it has been fragmentary in the sense that self and society has been separated. Self, society, and then political structure of power has been separated. A fractal analysis that doesn't get into the totality of the relationship between self and this structure of power. This is I think that it has a extremely powerful analytical sort of a powerful analytical tool to get us out of this very sort of a narrow way of explaining what is happening in a society. And I think that the Middle East is not separated from that. We need to understand it in that way. What is happening to people, what is happening to women is not separated from the entire complex state policy of securitization of life, of militarization of life, of the control of the women's bodies and relationship in all aspects of the public and private life, in the sense that we cannot separate any of these. We cannot sort of fragment the society to all of it. We need to see that totality. But it means that we also have to pay attention to a real social dynamics of what is happening. I mean, in my field, in education, for example, I am looking at the government-imposed policies on regulating schools, regulating educational system, regulating and then managing textbooks, student-teacher dynamic, and the role of teachers in that. A classroom is a real sort of a lens that you can look at it and understand the entire complex policies, ideology, cultural practices, histories of this regime vis-a-vis its own citizens. Language suppression, the sacredness of motherhood, who is a citizen, who is not a citizen, what does it mean to be a Muslim woman? There are practices that are every year, millions of students, girls and boys, girls at age 9, boys at age 15, that they have to go through that. And that is the celebration of the marking of the move, sort of the transformation to adulthood, which is the beginning of the age maturity for women at 9 and at the age 9, and then for boys at age 15. I think that this is the most misogynist, violent form of the controlling of sexualities and bodies that it is happening in every schools every year for the last 40 years for millions of students in Iran. This is how we need to understand it. And it is by explaining in details. That's why that our work is very difficult. And it needs diligence and commitment in order to be able to build the solidarity around all of these things. By the way, as we are talking about this, all of this is happening in Turkey, with the rise of Islamism in Turkey too, with the changes in educational system.
And I'm sorry, there's 2 more questions. I'll read the one online, and then this person will ask her question, and we'll have to,
I'll just finish with one question and we'll finish.
Okay.
But go ahead.
Okay. So thank you. So this is from Shan Mehdi. Thank you to all the speakers for their insights. A question for Professor Junot. For non-Iranian Shias, I hope I'm pronouncing this well, the regime and their proxies are sometimes looked as the only effective bulwark against anti-Shia violence by groups such as ISIS in countries such as Iraq, Syria, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. How will the post-regime Iran affect non-Iranian Shias around the world?
That's another simple question. I'll try to be very brief on that because I see that the time is getting short. And if I'm not mistaken, I think that's one of our students at GISPIA who just asked that question. So it's a very good question, of course. Iran's foreign policy is not pro-Shia. And it is not driven by Shia affinities. And there's a bit of a myth, and we were talking about representation, simplified representations in the media in the West and so on, a lot of them on gender and so on. You always hear in the media, Shia Iran has done this, and mobilizing Shia identities in Lebanon or in Iraq or elsewhere. There's a grain of truth to that, but in my view, Iran's foreign policy is largely driven by non-religious factors. And it certainly has not been driven by the rhetoric that you've heard, especially early on in the revolution, but since then too, of protecting the oppressed Shia or the oppressed Muslims in general, or even broader than that, the oppressed in general. That's rhetoric, it's not reality. So in a post-Islamic Republic world, to be brief, that won't change because it wasn't happening before, at least it wasn't happening very much. The idea that Iran and groups that it supported in Iraq acted as bulwarks against the Islamic State again has a grain of truth to it, in the sense that especially in the early days, in the crazy weeks of mid-2014, when the Islamic State exploded out of Syria and invaded chunks of Iraq, it's true that Iraqi militias, most of them Shia, but not all of them, supported by Iran, acted as a bulwark. But they were not and have never been the solution to counter the Islamic State. The solution to counter the Islamic State is democracy and stability and prosperity and development in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere. Iran-backed groups in Iraq, but for that matter in Syria too, Assad and others, have not been bulwarks against the Islamic State. They've fueled the Islamic State. So not to say that a post-Islamic Republic world will solve all of these problems. It won't, because there are other factors, but it will help a bit.
Thank you. Thank you.
Go ahead with your question.
Merci, Marcel.
Is it on now or let me see.
Oh, there you go. Okay. Thank you all for speaking tonight. My question was because Professor Junot, you mentioned how there has been a lot of sometimes well-intentioned and not well-intentioned involvement in the Middle East from the West. So my question was, to what extent can international support and the protests that have been happening across the world impact this movement in Iran, and also kind of how far can we help take this movement internationally, and maybe more specifically scholars and different universities like the University of Ottawa, to what extent can we help to push forward this movement, especially considering the work and activism of the Iranian Scholars for Liberty. This is open to anyone, but that's my question. Thank you.
I mean, I can go briefly, but hopefully others too. I think, as I said at the end of my presentation, my default position is to be skeptical of Western efforts to support democracy in the Middle East or elsewhere. The skepticism is not restricted to the Middle East. Again, because the theory is, of course, good, support democracy, which I support in theory. The problem is that in practice, experience and precedent amply shows that even when these efforts are well-intentioned, in many cases, they don't work out well. And in many cases, the efforts are in practice not well-intentioned. And that goes back to the question from the gentleman over there, which is a reality that I don't enjoy, but that I think is reality. So in the case of Iran, rule number one is do no harm. Ways to do harm is to support the wrong actors. There are some elements of the opposition in exile, but also inside Iran, that we don't want to support because they are not democratic, they're not legitimate. That definitely goes for the MEK in particular, but other elements too. So the first thing to do, and as a former public servant, I very much think in those terms, is the logistics of doing it, which are extremely difficult. And people roll their eyes when you talk about that, but it actually matters in practice. Who do you support? Who deserves the support and who doesn't? And figuring that out is extremely difficult. And at this point, I don't think that we collectively, the West, whatever that exactly means, we haven't done enough homework in terms of figuring out who deserves that support and who doesn't, and then what kind of support. I mentioned technological dimensions. There's other ways to do that too, technological elements. And then how do you actually bring that support to those elements who you think deserve it? That is extremely difficult. And exactly how to do that, I don't have the answer. And that's kind of my point in many ways. So in theory, yes. In practice, let's be careful and not make wrong choices. And I'll stop there.
Anybody else would like to address this question?
Yes, I will not. There are many things that you can do, any activist can do outside of Iran, is that be in solidarity with Iranian diaspora. And the other things is that, I don't know if you've heard, but Iranian try to convince European to put IRGC as the list of terrorists. What they first they considered it and then they refused to put. What the international community can do is that put pressure to isolate Iranian government, to close the embassies all over the world. If they are not, they have less income sources just to buy weapons to repress people, their own people in Iran. It will finish. There's a one way for that solution to make that stop. It's not the rocket science. That there are ways to stop this regime, to stop the repression, and to kill their own people inside of Iran, just to carry the voice of Iranians and what is going on. We saw the result. I have to mention that in 1988, this government, this itself, they killed more than 400,000 of prisoners in one summer, in less than 3 months. But what happened since September? They couldn't go further than that. 2 weeks ago, on Twitter, they announced that two of the prisoners with the penalty, with the death penalty. They were making them ready to execute at the call of pray time at around 5 in the morning. And by hearing that, people in Iran, they were going in front of the prison just to, and including the family itself, the family of those 2 young men. And it stopped. Because it was the solidarity, it was the action, it was the activism among Iranian inside and outside of Iran, and it stopped. So it saved those lives, and it can continue to do that. We see that in some way, even though they don't have any shame, and they can go towards. I remind everyone I quote Khomeini, which was the founder of Islamic Revolution. Some months after the revolution, he mentioned that that's his words, that by keeping the Islamic Republic has the priority for us. Even it's more important than the Imam of time, 12th Imam for Shia, and the life of an individual. So they go to the end of the world to keep this regime alive. We know that there is no shame, but still, as we saw the result of this mobilization of diaspora community and the resistance of Iran in Iran. So I say continuous mobilization of diaspora plus the resistance of Iranians in Iran can make this revolution accomplished.
I just want to add a couple of comments. I actually agree. I don't think other states should interfere or plan for change. I think Iranians have shown they are capable of doing it. But what we can do as a international community, we keep the issue on the public agenda to discuss it. Also, what states and universities can afford to create a space for discussion about, okay, now we have this social change has happened. What form, say, the Constitution can take? What are the forms to facilitate that kind of discussion that unfortunately is not happening, whether it is in diaspora or more so within Iran, but we don't get, it can't, because they don't have tribune, except as even social media is very limited in terms of putting everything political there. So to actually have that facility to discuss how would the political power should be divided so that we don't have it so much concentrated in one place. When it was under the Shah or under this regime, the fact was the political power was concentrated in a very small group. And on those situations, you can evolve democracy. Although in the present situation in Iran, social change has happened, but as the society has become much more democratic, especially within the family structure, the state has become more dictatorial. So my way of saying how generally situation in Iran is, like I feel like it's like a train that the driver is going toward the past, where the passengers are going towards future. And so, of course, at some stage, this will break. It cannot deliver. But I think the public discussion of what we should do, what form it should be, rather than being very ideological, in practice, we have to do this. And I think scholars, people who are part of this can actually produce that situation. But I, for one, I do not want any state to interfere. We saw what happened in Afghanistan. We saw what happened in Iraq, and not that even Islamic countries like Saudi Arabia interference in Yemen. In all of these things end up to be, in the end, we end up to be worse than when previously. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't show solidarity and support on those corners that we can, and it can be positive. Thank you.
Anybody else would like to say a last word? I think that, and I mean, I have tons of questions. I hope I could keep you for another hour, but it's not possible. I know that other had also questions, but thank you very much for being here, for your analysis and for answering your questions, your presentations, and thank you to the audience also.
I'd like to also thank the operators above our heads, Andrew and Ali, and also the team that organized this very, very interesting roundtable and inspiring and stimulating roundtable. So thank you to Farinas, thank you to Rodave, thank you to Hadanis, thank you to my colleague, and really have a lovely end of day.